To be here and have the opportunity to talk to you today concerning the origins of archaeological fieldwork in the UAE, set more broadly in the context of the practice of archaeology within the ancient Near East. Over the next 19 minutes and 20 seconds, I hope I'm able to present a broad overview of the way in which the development of archaeology here in the late 1950s and early 1960s was fundamentally different, not just in terms of the chronology, but in terms of practice, than that which had developed across a century and a half earlier in the rest of the ancient Near East. So I'm going to talk briefly then about the history of Near Eastern archaeological research, the UAE at the beginnings of archaeological research, the role of Sheikh Zayed, and the outcomes of archaeological research briefly once they fix the monitor up so I don't have to keep turning around. The beginnings of ancient Near Eastern archaeological research was effectively in the middle of the 19th century a search for large-scale antiquities. Now this is not to say that that necessarily drove all archaeological research throughout the Middle Eastern region, but it's fair to say that the way in which archaeology as a discipline, both in terms of its outcomes and its practice, was conveyed to Europe through the large-scale removal of antiquities from the region into British and European museums. So, for example, which you can see in front of you, the removal of colossal Neo-Assyrian statues from the site of Nineveh, and then on the far left, we can see the image of the statues being removed by relatively faceless local people in northern Iraq, and then being directed by the European archaeologists standing at the top of the balk. And then the next stage is then the bringing of this object or a similar object into the British Museum, where it is now currently located. This large-scale removal of antiquities created a monumental representation of the ancient Near East. It served to codify or to reinforce the idea that monumental objects or monumental buildings, monumentality, was one of the hallmarks of the ancient Near East, and in those areas where there might not be monumental reliefs or monumental buildings, that there was little of interest to study. This continued, but in a slightly different frame in the post-World War I period, when the practice of Near Eastern archaeology became codified into a colonial discipline. So, for example, following the end of World War I in 1918 and the subsequent Treaty of Sèvres, the large parts of the Middle East were divided up amongst European powers. So, for example, the British gained some control over the practice of archaeology in Iraq, and the French similarly with Syria and Lebanon, and the British also in Palestine. During this time, the praxis or the practice of archaeological research was embedded within a colonial framework. So who got to choose where was excavated, what was excavated, and where it was brought to was fundamentally determined by largely emplaced colonial officials coming from Paris and London. This continued, this practice continued the export of antiquities, and in particular served to sort of valorize existing understandings of the ancient Near East through the appearance of objects in museums and the somewhat sensational coverage of discoveries in Western newspapers. There was also another aspect of it which I think is very important, and that is the visual or the day-to-day life of the excavation and how that contoured the understanding of archaeology. So, for example, here we see Sir Leonard Woolley conducting excavations at Ore. This is a fairly standard shot from the University of Pennsylvania Museum, which shows him standing there and directing locals, archaeologists, whose opinion was rarely, in fact, engaged with as to the nature of their own antiquity and heritage. This also involved large-scale mobilization of enormous workforces, such as we can see here in the excavation of the Great Death Pit at Ur, with hundreds of local workers from southern Iraq being mobilized for a single purpose. And that single purpose was, in fact, so that nice objects could be taken from the ground, as we can see here. And I think this is a great photo, the way it casts everything, both personal and object, into shadow in the background. And the focus is on the British archaeologist removing this, of course, very famous early dynastic period object from the ground, and eventually it being placed into a museum. Now, the UAE was largely absent from these currents of fieldwork and practice. It didn't engage in, European archaeologists were not engaged here. And part of that is due to the fact that there was not the colonial structures which existed elsewhere in the broader MENA region. So in that sense, I would argue that the UAE escaped some of the more negative practices and connotations of the archaeological research which was being conducted in Iraq and Palestine and Syria during this period. But as we know, this part of the Middle East is also connected with South Asia. And so what's interesting is when we look at the development of archaeological practice in South Asia, India and Pakistan, then we see a similar practice. So these are examples of excavations conducted by British officials in what is now political India, in the south of India. And we can see the construction of this image, the construction of the work, is along very similar practices that we've already seen, for example, in Iraq. And here just a photograph which really exemplifies this colonial practice. Here we can see the excavations also conducted by Sir Mortimer Wheeler, one of the so-called great British archaeologists. And we see the archaeologists with their pith hats excavating at the site of Archaeology in southern India, extracting these finds under the guise of very scientific excavations. You can notice, for example, the very strict trench lines that they have. This was also an important aspect of this research, that the pretense to being scientific in these excavations, particularly from the 1950s onwards, created a mechanism by which the discoveries and the interpretations could be seen as objective, that they were not feeding into narratives which were pre-existing or European in origin, but because they were scientific, they were seen as creating objective truths about the history of other countries. The third stage, perhaps, in the development of archaeological research in the ancient Near East is in the post-Second World War period, when complexity or the emergence of states becomes, ancient states, becomes the sort of main driver of archaeological research throughout the region. This is largely the result of the emergence of a particular form of American anthropological archaeology derived from cultural anthropology, which emphasized that societies seem to move towards a single point of state-level organization throughout the ancient world. In fact, the vast majority of states and the vast majority of ancient states are located in a very, very small geographical area. Throughout most of the ancient world, ancient states were the exception rather than the norm. But because this part of the Arabian Peninsula did not see the emergence of states in the Bronze Age and during and later periods, it was seen as less worthy of attention, that it was somehow not so important to excavate here. And this is, in fact, one of the hallmarks of the period, particularly in the 1950s and the 1960s, especially in North American archaeology of the ancient Near East. This fundamentally changed because of a series of events. I'll just quickly move through here, which culminated then in the emergence of archaeological research here in 1959. And here, it's important to consider that there is both a political and cultural process. That is, that archaeologists became interested at this time in in other forms of existence in the ancient world, but also it occurred at a time of a personality, Sheikh Zayed, that drove archaeological research. So this is important to consider, that Sheikh Zayed was responsible for inviting archaeologists to come to Al Ain in 1959. The footage that we see as a leader into the presentations is from that time. And that created an atmosphere of archaeological research which was truly collaborative. It engaged European archaeologists in a way in which this image so visually, succinctly communicates, in which there is a true collaboration and true respect. Gone, or indeed completely absent, are the colonial infrastructures which had contoured archaeological research so much in the rest of the ancient Near East. And this is not just a matter of practice, it's a matter of the way in which the absence of those structures liberates interpretation. It liberates ways in which people can see the past. And this was due to this welcoming, this hospitality which was given to the Danish archaeologists, and the facilitation of the work that Sheikh Zayed effected, which we've heard of already this morning, that created a new playground, a new arena in which archaeological research could be conducted. Just to show you some examples, some of which we've seen examples of already, but also one of the things which I would like to emphasize in my remaining time is that starting point of 1959, it is relatively late in the history of archaeological research in the region. But what's extraordinary is that within 10 years, there was a very rapid discovery of archaeological remains in this area. So from 1959 through to 1969, we saw the emergence of these, an understanding of the early Bronze Age, or the period from about 3000 BC, through the excavations of these tombs at Jebel Hafit. Here's some other examples of the Danish archaeologists from Mosgar Museum excavating these tombs. We saw the definition of the Umanar culture dating from 2,500 BC to 2000 BC on the excavations on Umanar Island. The establishment of the interior understanding of the Umanar culture, for example, in the excavations at Hili 1, which we see here. So as a result of these excavations, we began to understand the nature of sedentary settlement 4,500 years ago in this region. And indeed, these are some of the discoveries, but importantly, we gained a clearer understanding of the sorts of objects which were defined by these cultures, and the important role that trade played during the early Bronze Age and the Umanar period. Here, for example. And we also discovered the Iron Age material remains. It's important to remember that the Iron Age material culture, which was discovered between 1959 and 1969, was largely the result of the investigation of Bronze Age tombs. These Iron Age remains were found in reused tombs of the Bronze Age. So within the space of 10 years, the archaeological world gained an understanding of the period from around 3000 BC to 300 BC. This is an extraordinary, rapid understanding of prehistory. And it was done with the facilitation and the encouragement of Sheikh Zayed. But also what's critical to keep in mind is that this understanding of material culture, this understanding of a prehistory, which was really relatively quickly codified or understood, was already presented in a National Museum project which opened in November 1972 in our Lion National Museum. So in conclusion, what I would like to emphasize is that from the outset, archaeological research in this country has had a different, more collaborative framework. This is good for all the partners involved in archaeological research, but it's also good because it emphasizes that ultimately the research which is conducted in any country seeks to understand the history and archaeology of both that geographical location and the people that live there today and their ancient history. It's also important because freeing oneself of the colonial frameworks in which archaeological practice was conducted elsewhere permits a broader, more liberated understanding of the ancient world. And some of the papers that we've seen yesterday and we'll see in the coming days, I think will emphasize that. Thank you very much.